The Senate hearing room had gone silent. Every camera lens was fixed on one-man Governor Ron DeSantis as he leaned forward with that trademark confidence and asked a question that was meant to end the debate. "Representative Crockett," he said, "can you name a single law in your state that stops a legal voter from casting a ballot?" It sounded like a knockout punch. But what happened next didn't just stun the room, it changed the entire national conversation about voting rights. For 15 minutes, DeSantis had dominated the discussion. He came armed with data, constitutional citations, and a tone that mixed courtroom precision with political theater. Every word seemed carefully rehearsed, every statistic handpicked to prove that his laws had made elections both safer and stronger. But Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to trade talking points. When she finally leaned into her microphone, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand, she simply asked a question no one in the room saw coming. "Governor, would you like me to read your own sworn testimony back to you?" The air shifted instantly. DeSantis froze for a split second, long enough for every reporter to realize they were watching something rare. Not a political argument, but a constitutional takedown in real time. What followed wasn't a shouting match or a viral one-liner. It was a slow, methodical dismantling, a lawyer's precision, cutting through layers of political armor. And by the time it was over, even DeSantis' own supporters had to admit something in the balance of power had changed. But this moment didn't happen overnight. It was the result of months of rising tension, conflicting visions of democracy, and one fundamental question that has divided America for decades. Who really controls the right to vote, the states or the Constitution itself? And that's where our story begins. Two lawyers, two completely different visions of what democracy should look like. On one side, Representative Jasmine Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, known for walking into hearings with more evidence than emotion. She's not the type to chase sound bites, she builds cases. Before running for office, Crockett spent years defending the right to vote in Southern courtrooms, where access to the ballot box was anything but guaranteed. Every case she fought carried the same principle. No one should have to pay, plead, or prove more than anyone else to vote. At just 42, she'd already argued and won major cases before federal appeals courts. Her new proposal, the Federal Voter Protection Act, wasn't a sweeping takeover of state elections. It was designed with surgical precision: eliminate the hidden barriers, keep the legitimate safeguards. In her words, this isn't about partisan advantage. It's about the Constitution doing what it promises, protecting every eligible voter. And then there's Governor Ron DeSantis, a Harvard-trained lawyer, a Navy veteran, and a master of political combat. He'd built his national brand on the idea that states, not Washington, should control how elections are run. To his supporters, he was defending the integrity of the ballot. To his critics, he was tightening the rules just enough to make voting harder for certain communities. In Florida, DeSantis had pushed through some of the country's strictest election laws: tighter ID requirements, fewer drop boxes, bans on giving water to voters in line. He called them election integrity measures. Civil rights groups called them something else: barriers. So when he accepted an invitation to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee about Crockett's bill, the stage was already set for a constitutional clash. Both were lawyers. Both knew exactly how far the other could go before crossing a legal line. And both understood that this wasn't just another hearing, it was a televised test of truth and power. Behind the polished smiles and political pleasantries, each of them came armed with a simple goal: to expose the flaw in the other's logic before the cameras stopped rolling. Wanted proof that the governor's laws created real obstacles for real people. DeSantis wanted to prove that federal intervention was nothing more than overreach disguised as fairness. The stakes weren't just political, they were constitutional, because buried inside this debate was the oldest unresolved question in American democracy. Where does state power end and the promise of equal protection begin? And when the hearing began that morning, nobody realized they were about to watch that question answered live in front of millions. But before the first question was even asked, DeSantis had already made his move. From the moment Governor DeSantis took the stand, it was clear he'd come prepared for a fight, not a discussion. His opening statement ran like a well-oiled machine. No stumbles, no hesitation. He spoke about election integrity, public confidence, and safeguarding democracy. Each phrase sounded tested, rehearsed, and focus grouped to perfection. He leaned into the microphone and said, Florida's elections are a model for the nation. We have the highest transparency, the lowest fraud, and the fastest results. If anything, other states should be learning from us, not lecturing us." Reporters typed in silence. Cameras clicked like a metronome. For 15 minutes, DeSantis laid out his narrative. Florida's laws were fair, turnout had risen, and critics were exaggerating problems that didn't exist. He cited statistics showing that voter participation among minorities had even increased after his reforms numbers his team had repeated on talk shows for months. Then came the pivot. He turned toward the senators and delivered what he clearly thought was his mic drop line. "Not one eligible voter has been stopped from voting under these laws. Not one. If anyone can name a single case, I'd love to hear it." It was bold, confident, and dangerously absolute. Because across the table, Jasmine Crockett was already flipping through a binder filled with documents, court transcripts, and affidavits. She didn't interrupt. She let the governor finish his speech, thank the committee, and settle back in his chair like a man certain he'd won the room. Then quietly she said, "Governor, just to clarify, under oath you're saying that no law in your state prevents a legal voter from casting a ballot, is that correct?" He nodded. "That's right." Her eyes never left the papers in front of her. "And you're sure about that?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Completely sure." That's when she closed the binder, slid one page to the front, and said, "Interesting, because I have your deposition from Davis versus Florida, dated March 7th of last year, where you said something very different." A few reporters looked up. The room shifted. DeSantis straightened in his chair. "I'm sorry, what deposition?" Crockett didn't raise her voice. She just started to read. "In that testimony," she said, "you acknowledged that certain provisions of your state's election law, and I quote, could, in limited cases, create obstacles for elderly or disabled voters without access to transportation." DeSantis blinked, unsure whether to respond or stay quiet. She went on, "So if you admitted under oath that such obstacles exist, how can you claim today that not one eligible voter was stopped from voting?" The room went still. For a moment, the governor looked like he was about to answer, then stopped. The silence stretched, broken only by the clicks of reporters firing off tweets faster than they could think. What DeSantis hadn't realized was that his own words, buried deep in that deposition, had become the very evidence Crockett needed to turn his argument upside down. And that was only the beginning, because what she read next would leave the entire chamber speechless. The papers in Crockett's hands suddenly felt heavier than they looked. Everyone in that chamber, senators, aides, journalists, even the gallery, leaned forward as she began to read line by line. "This is page 72 of your sworn testimony, Governor," she said evenly. "You were asked whether your 2021 election law might inadvertently create barriers for seniors, for people with disabilities, or for those without transportation to reach new ID centers." She paused, and your answer was, quote, "It's possible that isolated instances could occur, but that's not the intent of the legislation." End quote. It wasn't explosive on the surface, just one phrase tucked deep in legal language, but every lawyer in that room understood what it meant. A single acknowledgement that barriers could occur was enough to undercut hours of confident testimony about zero impact. DeSantis tried to recover. "I was speaking hypothetically," he said, gripping the desk. "Those were potential scenarios, not proven cases." Crockett nodded as if expecting that answer. "Of course, but hypothetical or not, you conceded that the law could create an obstacle for certain voters. So when you say today that no one was affected, that's not hypothetical, that's a contradiction." Her tone never rose, but the impact was thunderous. Reporters glanced at each other, their screens lighting up with headlines they hadn't even finished writing yet. And Crockett wasn't done. She flipped to another page. On page 74, she continued, "You were asked about the Dropbox restrictions, and you responded that rural voters might experience, and I quote again, some difficulty adjusting to the new distance requirements. Governor, are you suggesting that those voters don't count as being affected?" For a second, DeSantis didn't answer. Then he said carefully, "The law treats all voters equally. Distance is not discrimination." That was the wrong answer, because Crockett leaned forward and replied, "Equality without access isn't equality, Governor." The words hit like a hammer. The audience broke into murmurs, a few audible gasps cutting through the silence. The chairman tried to gavel the room back to order, but it didn't matter, the moment had already landed. Within seconds, clips of that exchange were spreading online. One side called it a masterclass in accountability. The other called it political theater. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was the most intense confrontation in a Senate hearing in years. And for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just about scoring a point. It was about proving that words on paper have consequences, even when they belong to a governor. Still, she knew this argument wouldn't be won on technicalities alone. To make her case undeniable, she had to show that the law's impact wasn't just theoretical, it was human. And what she revealed next would turn statistics into stories and data into something impossible to ignore. For hours, the debate had circled around legal definitions and constitutional interpretations. But Crockett knew that words like burden, access, and equal protection didn't mean much to most Americans watching from home. So she did what every great lawyer does when logic meets resistance. She told a story. She opened a thin folder. This one filled not with legal citations, but with affidavits, real people, real names, real consequences. "Let's move beyond theory," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "Let's talk about what these laws actually did." The first story came from Mrs. Laverne Davis, a 78-year-old retired teacher from Jacksonville. She'd voted in every election since 1968, never missed one. But when Florida's new ID rules took effect, her driver's license had expired, and the nearest ID issuing office was 27 miles away. She didn't own a car. She didn't have family nearby. So to cast a ballot, she had to pay a neighbor $40 for gas and wait 3 hours in line. "That's the price of her right to vote," Crockett said quietly. $40 in 3 hours. For some people, that's groceries for the week. Then came Michael Rivera, a delivery driver who worked 12-hour shifts. When Florida reduced the number of drop boxes and restricted their hours, the one near his workplace was only open until 5 p.m., the exact time his shift ended. He mailed his ballot instead, but it arrived 2 days late and was rejected. Not because he didn't care, Crockett said, because he couldn't afford to leave work early. The final affidavit was from Cynthia Lee, a disabled veteran who'd relied on her church to collect and deliver ballots for homebound seniors, a practice that had been outlawed under the new rules. Miss Lee called the new hotline to ask how she could vote, Crockett explained. The volunteer told her to request the ride service. She lives on a fixed income. There was no ride service. The room was silent again. These weren't hypotheticals, they were faces, stories, and lives that the new policies had quietly pushed to the margins. Crockett leaned in. "Governor, these are your constituents. These are Floridians. You said no one was stopped from voting, but what do you call this?" DeSantis tried to respond, but she continued before he could. "Voting isn't supposed to be a luxury. It's not a test of privilege or endurance. It's a right." Her words cut through the silence like a verdict. Even the senator moderating the hearing looked shaken. On social media, clips of that exchange started trending under one phrase: the price of a vote. What had started as a legal debate was turning into a national moment of reckoning. And as the tension in that room reached its peak, Crockett wasn't finished. Because her next move would take the argument out of emotion and into the one place no politician could easily dodge: the Constitution itself. What she said next reframed the entire hearing and left the governor without a single line of defense. Crockett let the silence sit for a few seconds, long enough for the governor's confidence to fade. Then she looked up, calm but unflinching. "Governor," she said, "you've argued that these laws are about state sovereignty, but I have a question for you. Where does that sovereignty end?" DeSantis hesitated. "It ends where the Constitution allows it to," he said cautiously. "Exactly," Crockett replied. "And the Constitution doesn't allow it to end at the cost of someone's right to vote." The room froze again. What she was doing now wasn't just political, it was surgical. She wasn't attacking a person. She was redefining the battlefield. Crockett pulled out a small worn copy of the Constitution from her folder, the same one she carried through her years as a civil rights attorney. "This," she said, holding it up, "isn't a suggestion. It's the law. And it's very clear about one thing: when states try to restrict access to the ballot box, the federal government has not just the right, but the responsibility to step in." She began to cite the amendments like an attorney reciting evidence before a jury. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection. The 15th forbids denying the vote based on race. The 19th extends it to women. The 26th protects young voters. Each one of those exists because at some point, a state claimed it had the sovereign right to make its own rules, and every single time the Constitution overruled it. Every word hit like a gavel. She continued, "Federal oversight doesn't erase state power, it keeps it honest. Because rights don't belong to the state's governor. They belong to the people." DeSantis shifted in his seat, realizing the trap had closed. He couldn't argue with the Constitution, not on camera, not in that room. Every legal scholar watching knew it. Every headline writer saw it forming. Crockett uses Constitution to corner DeSantis. Then she leaned forward for the final blow. "When you say your laws treat everyone equally, that sounds fair until you remember that equal rules don't always create equal results. If a rule makes it harder for one group to participate than another, that's not equality. That's exclusion dressed up as order." The words echoed. Even some of the governor's allies stayed quiet. Crockett's voice softened, almost like she was talking directly to the viewers watching at home. "The right to vote isn't supposed to depend on where you live, what you earn, or how far you can travel. That's not liberty, that's luck. And luck," she said, "should never decide democracy." The governor didn't respond. There wasn't much left to say. In the crowd, reporters were already filing their leads. One headline read, "Crockett's Constitutional Lesson Shakes Senate Hearing." Another simply said, "The moment DeSantis went silent." But Crockett wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in impact. Because after that exchange, it wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a turning point. And while the cameras captured every second of that showdown, what happened after the hearing might have been even more surprising. Because 3 days later, the narrative shifted, and 3 years later, the laws themselves would too. When the hearing adjourned, the air in the chamber still buzzed like static. Governor DeSantis left first, his staff moving quickly through the side doors, eyes fixed straight ahead. Crockett stayed seated for a moment, quiet, focused, almost meditative, as if absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Within hours, clips of the exchange dominated every major network. Cable panels replayed her cross-examination frame by frame. Commentators who usually disagreed on everything found rare common ground. They called it one of the sharpest, most substantive congressional moments in years. But outside the spin rooms and social media scrolls, something deeper had shifted. For many Americans watching from home, it wasn't just another partisan showdown, it was a civics lesson in real time. Viewers saw a member of Congress use preparation, evidence, and constitutional argument to hold a sitting governor accountable not through insults or sound bites, but through facts and law. In classrooms, professors of political science and law began dissecting the exchange as a case study in constitutional oversight. Law students analyzed Crockett's strategy, her calm pacing, her timing, the way she layered testimony, data, and moral framing until her opponent had no exit. Some called it the Crockett method, a model of how evidence and constitutional literacy could still cut through political noise. Even in Florida, the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. Within 6 months, the state legislature passed modest but meaningful reforms, expanded ID access, extended drop-box hours, and new exemptions for elderly and disabled voters. No one officially credited the hearing, but the timing spoke for itself. And nationally, something else was changing too. Several states began conducting voter accessibility impact reviews, a concept that hadn't existed before. Election officials, across party lines, quietly admitted that Crockett's arguments had exposed gaps they could no longer deny. Governor DeSantis adjusted his tone as well. In a follow-up interview, he conceded, "We can always do better to make sure every eligible voter has access." It wasn't an apology, but it was a shift. Even his allies noticed the difference. Less absolutism, more caution. For Representative Crockett, the moment became both a spotlight and a responsibility. Invitations poured in law schools, civil rights groups, even bipartisan policy forums wanted her insights. But she stayed consistent. "This was never about embarrassing anyone," she said in an interview months later. "It was about defending the document that governs us all." And that more than any viral clip was the real takeaway. Because what the country saw that day wasn't just one lawmaker outmaneuvering another. It was a reminder of what constitutional oversight is supposed to look like. Principled, evidence-driven, and rooted in the idea that the rule of law still means something. In a political era often defined by spectacle, The Crockett-DeSantis hearing stood out because it wasn't theater. It was substance constitutional debate at its sharpest, framed by real human consequences. And long after the headlines faded, that's what endured. A single hearing had reignited a conversation about what the Constitution demands and who it's meant to protect. Because in the end, Crockett's closing words became the lasting echo of the entire episode. The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of Americans who are convenient to accommodate. It protects all Americans. In the weeks that followed, the headlines faded, the hearings moved on, and the political world found new controversies to feed on. But that one exchange, those few minutes when a congresswoman read a governor's own sworn words back to him, never really disappeared. Because beneath all the politics, something fundamental had been exposed. Not about Ron DeSantis, not even about Jasmine Crockett, but about us and how fragile our democracy becomes when the people in power forget that constitutional rights aren't conditional. For decades, politicians have argued over the same question: who should decide how Americans vote, the states or the Constitution? But the real question, the one Crockett forced everyone to face, is simpler and far more uncomfortable. What happens when the laws written to protect our elections start protecting power instead of people? It's easy to talk about integrity, to build policies that sound responsible, to throw around words like security and sovereignty. But when those words start standing between citizens and the ballot box, the meaning of democracy begins to shrink. And once it shrinks for some, it can shrink for all. That's why the Crockett-DeSantis hearing mattered. Because in a room filled with titles, cameras, and talking points, one person used the Constitution like a mirror, forcing everyone to see whether their version of freedom still included every American. The truth is, democracy doesn't die in one big moment. It erodes quietly through complicated language, subtle restrictions, and the slow normalization of inequality disguised as efficiency. Crockett's cross-examination was a warning that even the smallest barriers left unchallenged can grow into walls. So the next time you hear a politician talk about election integrity, remember this exchange. Remember the silence that followed her question and the uncomfortable truth it revealed. That the real test of integrity isn't how tightly we control the vote, it's how fiercely we protect it. Because in the end, the Constitution doesn't choose sides. It only asks one question: are you living up to the promise you swore to defend?